Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I do have to make clear, from a place of respect, that this government will not risk its mandate for economic stability under any circumstances. And with tough decisions on the horizon, pay will inevitably be shaped by that.
Keir Starmer there making the first address by a Prime Minister to the Trades Union Congress in 15 years. Does that qualify as Labour speaking to Labour? Hello, welcome to the Bloomberg UK Politics podcast. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan Potts. So the government's finances are frankly a mess. That's fairly uncontroversial. The Chancellor says there's a £22 billion fiscal black hole, broadly uncontested, although the new government has added to that deficit with spending commitments. The £300 winter fuel payment goes to many wealthy older pensioners who don't need it. That's really a statement of fact. But the withdrawal of the payment from more than 9 million people, many of whom do need it, well, that has proved very controversial.
Yeah, look, a couple of numbers there and a few more to add to that as well. So the gain to the public purse from means testing the winter fuel allowance, £1.5 billion. So only going a small way to dealing with the bigger fiscal problems. Meanwhile, we learned today from separate data out on UK wages how much the pension is likely to go up by next year, around £460 a year, which could raise spending on pensions by £8 billion, more than, in fact. So in the face of those numbers, is this move to means test the winter fuel allowance bringing in enough cash for the political capital that's being spent on it? One of the big topics we're discussing today.
Yeah, well, that's the key question, isn't it? Well, joining us for a wider conversation about pensions, Steve Webb, former pensions minister in the Lib Dem Tory coalition government, now partner at financial consultants Lane Clark and Peacock. Steve, you were in government faced with tough decisions. What do you make of the row over the winter fuel allowance?
I certainly think that separating the savings on winter fuel payments from the rest of the budget was just a mistake. The reason they did it in July rather than wait till the budget in October is they wanted to save money in the current financial year. And because winter fuel payments don't get paid till November or December, as long as they made the announcement in July, they could put the law through in September and make the cut straight away. So that's why it was separated. But it politically sent a message that said, you're first against the wall. You are the group that we value the least. We think you're the least deserving. And to say that to the entire pensioner population was a misjudgment at the very least, particularly at a time when the energy price cap was about to go up a few weeks later. So I think, if it had happened in a budget when everybody else was feeling the pain, we might have said, well, we're all in this together. But I think pensioners particularly aggrieved by the timing.
Is this just not in any way a politically explosive issue when you want to make changes to any policies that affect pensioners? We know there are part of the electorate who are obviously particularly financially sensitive for obvious reasons, but also those who are likely to vote, so politically sensitive as well. I mean, is it possible to make any changes to entitlements for pensioners without it being extremely controversial?
I guess there is a precedent which would be, well, there's two really. I mean, I suppose one is freezing allowances. Freezing tax-free personal allowances, which means more and more pensioners are now paying tax. About just under 3/4 of all pensioners now pay tax. And that's often called a stealth tax because you don't ever change the rate. You just leave it sitting there to be eroded relative to the value of the pension. And you could argue that although pensioners are grumpy and the fact that more pensioners pay tax, that it's been a slow burn, boiling the frog slowly, you might say. A more sort of abrupt one was George Osborne in 2012 imposed what became known as the granny tax, which was that pensioners actually back in the day used to get additional tax-free allowances. And he said, well, there's no justification for that. We're going to phase it out. And that did actually happen, but it was very unpopular at the time. So there isn't an easy way around this, but because you're talking about 10, 11 million people, you can actually raise some serious money if you take modest amounts per head off pensioners.
We now know the triple lock will mean pensions go up by £460 next year. That's way in excess of inflation. Do you think the triple lock has become politically untouchable? And if you avoid the politics, would you change the triple lock? Do you think it's the right policy?
It's worth a bit of context. So the triple lock I implemented in 2010, 2011 at the start of the coalition, and it came off the back of 30 years of decline in the value of the pension relative to what people earn. So if you think that the purpose of a pension is to give you some sort of smooth standard of living from when you have a wage to when you don't, you want some sort of link between the value of the state pension and other pensions and average earnings. But for 30 years prior to 2010, the pension had been linked to prices mostly, once famously going up just by 75p. So the triple lock was saying we've had 30 years of damage. we need a mechanism to try and restore some of that. So that's why it was implemented, and it's been more politically durable than I certainly expected, 15 years ago, 14 years ago. And there is a commitment for the end of this parliament. I think when it's done its job, you could switch it off. And if its job is to get the state pension up to some sort of decent level, maybe a third of the average wage, it's there, it's doing its job, but it will have an end date. And it would be sensible to say what that end date is now, I think.
And I suppose, how quickly could it end then? I mean, as you say, commitment to the end of this parliament, but should that be it in your view?
I think rather than pick an arbitrary date, I'd pick a target level of the pension. So if we think, let's say, so it's often said that you need 2/3 of your pre-retirement income once you've retired. You don't need 100% of it because you don't have pay national insurance, you don't have travel to work costs, you don't have various other costs. So you don't need exactly what you had when you were an earner. But let's say you need 2/3 to maintain your standard of living. And if you said roughly 50-50 split between state and private provision, then that takes you to the state pension needing to be about a third of the average wage. So I think I wouldn't particularly say switch it off in a certain month or a certain year. I'd say look at how you're doing relative to the average wage, and when you hit a third, then just peg it. So you peg it at a third of the average wage, whatever that is.
I'm interested to know if looking back, you think it was the right policy to put in place. I take your point about growing pensions so they're a bit more generous than they were in the past, which was not very generous at all. But do you it has put the government in something of a kind of political headlock, hasn't it? Do you sort of regret the way it was implemented?
No, I mean, people, the purists say, oh, it's unpredictable and it binds governments. But that was the point. The point was to bind the government. So everything else in government, when I was a minister, you had to go cap in hand to the Treasury, bribe, cajole, beg for money for your pet projects. But when you had a rule, a formula, the triple lock, we just knew that's what would happen to the pension. We didn't have an annual debate about it. It just happened. And to get pensions up systematically over a period of decades to reverse 30 years of decline, you can't rely on the annual largesse of the Chancellor of the day, because he's always got other, or she in this case, other things to spend the money on every year. So actually, if you think a job needs doing, you need a formula is a very effective way of doing it.
What would a new formula look like, I wonder? Because I don't think it's likely that any politician would scrap the triple lock without some sort of plan to replace it.
Yeah, so the obvious thing to do is if you said, we will pay a pension of a third of the national average wage. Now, that is a straight earnings link. Now, that's a bit messy because there will be some years when inflation is higher than earnings growth. So when you get a real wage fall, that does happen sometimes. And it's very hard to then pay increases below inflation. But what they do in Australia is a sort of smoothing. So they say, we're going to target a fraction of the average wage. In strange years when actually prices go up by average earnings, we do a bit more. We keep pace with prices, and then we claw it back in the years when wages are rising faster. So we used to call it in the department, we called it Aussie rules. But it's not a bad way of doing it. It sort of deals with the politics and gives you a sensible target for the state pension.
I want to get back to the government's finances. Pensions tax relief is enormously expensive, something in the region of £50 billion a year. It's surely an attractive target for the government when it's scrabbling for money. What do you think about limiting pension tax relief, perhaps cutting it to 20 or 30%?
There's no doubt that given the large sums involved on tax relief and given the pledge not to raise income tax, national insurance, VAT and corporation tax rates, which probably account for more than 2/3 of all taxes, they're bound to be looking at it. It will have made it from a long list to a short list, I'm sure of that. But there's lots of different aspects of the system you could change. So one, I mean, today the Resolution Foundation have got a report out talking about the national insurance that isn't paid when money goes into a pension. So if I, as an employer, pay you a wage, you pay national insurance and I pay national insurance. Whereas if I pay money into a pension, neither of us does. Well, that might be regarded as unnecessarily favourable. So NI could be part of this conversation. Flat rate tax relief is very, very messy because a lot of tax relief goes to people in public sector defined benefit schemes, teachers, nurses, civil servants, and so on. And just trying to work out how all of that works and implementing it for people at different income levels, just administratively very messy. And politically, the government has decided to prioritise decent pay for public sector workers. So it would be very odd to then do something that took billions off reasonably senior teachers, nurses and civil servants. So for that reason, I don't think that's the route they'll go down. But there are other things in pension tax relief, of which NI is one, maybe capping tax-free cash is another. So they will be looking very, very hard at that space.
But winding down some of those or reducing some of those tax incentives to get people to put money into their pension, would you see that as dissuading people or disincentivizing people? Will people end up saving less for retirement as a result?
I think there's very little evidence that standard rate tax relief is any meaningful incentive to save into pension. People, to be honest, don't even know they're getting it often because of the way it's administered. For a higher rate taxpayer who, for example, thinks they might be a basic rate taxpayer in retirement, it's very attractive. But to be honest, higher rate taxpayers can look after themselves. I don't think the government needs to worry too much about the incentives for higher rate taxpayers to save into a pension because they're not going to be making claim on the state anyway. Tax-free cash, the 25% tax-free lump sum is a big incentive to save in a pension, probably the distinctive one that people actually know about. So if you muck about with that, you could discourage pension saving. But most people will not be dependent on benefits in retirement. We've got, particularly if you have a decent state pension. So the fiscal need for people to save a lot is not particularly powerful. The reason we want people to save a lot is so that they don't get a slump in their standard of living into retirement. And that's the worry, really. You don't want to dissuade people from saving for that reason.
Just a quick one to finish on. Leaving aside the government's need to raise cash, what reforms, what one or two major reforms would you like to see to make the pension system work better?
The big change that's happened in recent years is we've gone from traditional final salary type defined benefit pensions to pot of money type defined contribution pensions. And that has put all of the risk of managing the money, dealing with inflation and investment risk and longevity risk all on individuals. So I think the risk transfer is quite worrying for individuals. I'm 73 or 83, I've got to manage a drawdown pot. How on earth am I going to do that? So I think we need to look at more collective solutions, collective DC being one of them. But I think also we just need to look at the amount going in. Well over twice as much was going in the days of defined benefit as is going in now. And although the government says, our priority is productive finance and better rates of return, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. If there ain't enough money going in, people are not going to get good pensions. So we've got to get on with getting contribution rates up.
Steve, great to talk to you. Thanks for your time. Steve Webb, their former pensions minister and partner now at Lane Clark and Peacock. A really interesting thought to leave it on there as we're looking at some of the many challenges that the Chancellor is going to be facing in the budget. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and our audio engineer was Sean Grostamachia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.